Hello and welcome, I'm Joshua Barnes and you're watching NewsX World. Let's first take a look at our headlines. Donald Trump has acknowledged that there is a possibility that Russian President Vladimir Putin doesn't want a peace deal with Ukraine, but says he hopes a meeting with Putin and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky goes good. Meanwhile, Trump rules out US troops being deployed to Ukraine, but eyes aerial support for security. Well, this comes as the US and European military planners have begun exploring post-conflict security guarantees for Ukraine. According to officials, the move follows President Donald Trump's pledge during Monday's summit to help protect Kyiv under any peace deal with Russia. This comes as a reported Ukrainian drone attack late on Tuesday knocked out power in parts of Russian-held Zaporizhzhia. Russian forces control most of the region, but Kyiv holds the administrative centre and has repeatedly disrupted power in occupied areas. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt says the US is discussing a ceasefire proposal for a 60-day truce in Gaza, which Hamas has accepted. Israel say they want all hostages to be released at once as protests continue in Israel over ending the war and reaching a hostage deal. Meanwhile, the White House has said that US President Donald Trump imposed steep additional tariffs on Indian goods to end the war in Ukraine. The move doubled India's tariffs to 50%, with the new rates taking effect on August the 27th. India and China agreed to resume direct flights and boost trade and investment as they rebuild ties damaged by the 2020 border clashes. The deal includes reopening border trade points and easing visa rules, India's foreign ministry has said. North Korea's Kim Yo-jong accused South Korean President Lee Jae-myung of a dual personality for seeking peace while holding joint drills with the US. The exercises test an upgraded response to North Korean nuclear threats. And Syrian Foreign Minister Assad al-Shabani has met an Israeli delegation in Paris to discuss regional stability. The US-mediated talks focused on de-escalation in southern Syria and non-interference in Syria's domestic affairs. But we start this hour as President Donald Trump has ruled out putting US troops on the ground in Ukraine, but says the US could provide air support as part of a deal to end the war. Let's now listen to what Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt has said on the matter.
Well, you got to the heart of what I was going to say to all of you today on security guarantees, which is the president has definitively stated U.S. boots will not be on the ground in Ukraine, but we can certainly help in the coordination and perhaps provide other means of security guarantees to our European allies. The president understands security guarantees are crucially important to ensure a lasting peace, and he has directed his national security team to coordinate with our friends in Europe and also to continue to cooperate and discuss these matters with Ukraine and Russia as well.
Well, speaking to Fox News, Trump suggested Europe may commit ground forces while Washington could help, probably by air. The president did not elaborate, but stressed his negotiating style was guided by instinct more than process. Let's now listen into that full statement.
I hope President Putin is going to be good, and if he's not, it's going to be a rough situation. And I hope that President Zelensky will do what he has to do. He has to show some flexibility also. We're going to find out about President Putin in the next couple of weeks, that I can tell you. And we're going to see where it all goes. It's possible that he doesn't want to make a deal. I called President Putin, and we're trying to work out a meeting with President Zelensky. We'll see what happens there. And then if it works out, then I'll go to the trilat and close it up.
Well, the comments come a day after Trump pledged new security guarantees at a White House summit with allies, but uncertainty remains. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky hailed the talks as a major step forward, and discussions are underway about a possible trilateral summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Venues floated include Budapest, Istanbul and Switzerland. We'll now listen in to what Caroline Leavitt has said about the possible venue of these bilateral or trilateral talks involving Russia's Vladimir Putin, Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky and potentially Donald Trump.
Look, I'm not going to litigate the private conversations between the president and President Putin, aside from what the president himself has already spoken on. But I can tell you there are many options that are being discussed by our national security team right now with both parties. Well, look, the president has spoken to both leaders about this, and both leaders have expressed a willingness to sit down with each other. And so our national security team will help both countries do that. Ultimately, the president has always said that there are areas of disagreement in this war that will have to be discussed and decided upon by these two countries.
Well, joining us this morning to discuss the latest developments from this ongoing discussion on peace between Russia and Ukraine is Jim Rice, a professor of international law who joins us live from Vigan in the Philippines. Jim, it is a pleasure, as always, to have you on the programme this morning. Thank you for your time. Trump has made many statements there, but first I want to focus on one about Vladimir Putin. He says there is a possibility that Russia doesn't agree to a deal. Does this throw all of the talks back wide open once again?
Again, this is a volatile situation, and we're dealing with a very chaotic and volatile personality in Donald Trump. So, as to the latest comments, I don't really know, but more recently than that, I would just like just further back, I'd just like to reiterate how great a job the European allies did in terms of talking to Trump in the White House in Washington, D.C. I think that this is a very important step that they took, and I think that the idea of stressing the idea of security guarantees as a means of providing a durable and lasting peace is essential. The problem, though, as to try and answer your question, will these either bilateral or trilateral meetings take place? I'm very skeptical about this for a few reasons. First of all, it can't be ignored that Putin has tried to have Zelensky murdered on several occasions. So there's that. Secondly, Putin doesn't recognize Zelensky as the president of Ukraine, nor does he recognize the democratic and sovereign country of Ukraine as being a real country. And finally, the third reason that I'm skeptical is, as you alluded to in your introduction, where would this meeting take place? Putin is an indicted war criminal, and he obviously couldn't appear in places in Western Europe or other Western-style democracies. So it would probably have to be some kind of Gulf location, but I'm not even sure. Therefore, I'm skeptical about this meeting taking place.
Yeah, absolutely, Jim. Of course, Budapest, Istanbul have been suggested. Vladimir Putin himself suggesting Moscow yesterday. And of course, Volodymyr Zelensky is in a position where he may want to decline that for obvious security risks. But Jim, let's move on to some further comments from Donald Trump. He says US boots won't be on the ground in Ukraine, but does talk about air support. Of course, air support is a key point of contention for Ukraine. These Patriot missile systems have been something that they've been looking for throughout the war. How do you think this security guarantee will play out, not just from the US, but also from Europe, who are currently talking with the US and putting plans in place for if a ceasefire or end to the war is agreed?
Well, great question. Given the fact that American troops on the ground has been ruled out, then the second best would be what has been referred to as an air exclusion zone, where U.S. Air Force planes would be patrolling the skies and would be looking out for any future Russian aggression into the sovereign country of Ukraine. The problem with that is, well, this has been discussed. Again, I'm skeptical. I really don't believe that in the end Trump will go through with this because, number one, he is susceptible to anything that Putin doesn't like. And number two, Trump is just simply completely chaotic and isn't able to carry forward any kind of coherent policy.
And Jim, before we move on to a related development, let's look at Volodymyr Zelensky. Again, positive. Of course, it seems that he was on somewhat of a charm offensive this time round, visiting Washington, backed with his European allies. But he has said that these talks are a major step forward. What does Volodymyr Zelensky need to do next in order to try and push this peace forward? Is it all now about concessions from Ukraine to try and get a deal closed?
Well, one of the things that I think would be an absolute red line for Ukraine and for Zelensky would be ceding or giving up more land to Russia, simply because it's wrong, it doesn't work, and any territory that would be given up to Russia, moving west, would basically be a highway that would open its way up to an invasion of Kiev. So I would say that this is definitely a red line, and both Zelensky and the Western allies will say this is a deal breaker.
Yes, Jim, please do stay with us as we do now look to a related development. Of course, so many talks are ongoing across the continent, and NATO's 32 military chiefs will meet by video today to review the war in Ukraine. The alliance's military committee says US General Alexis Greenwich will brief leaders on the current security situation as diplomatic efforts for peace continue. Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico said Western countries must accept that Ukraine cannot join NATO and that territorial discussions will be necessary to end the conflict. European Council President Antonio Costa, after briefing EU leaders on this week's Washington summit, said the possibility of a meeting between Volodymyr Zelensky and Vladimir Putin marked enormous progress. Costa stressed Europe must be part of any peace process and called for Ukraine's EU accession to move forward, and welcomed US readiness to back security guarantees. He added that Ukraine's armed forces remain the foundation of those guarantees while the EU prepares fresh sanctions on Russia. Meanwhile, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says that any peace deal on Ukraine must ensure Russia's security and that of Russians in Ukraine. Well, Jim, thank you for staying with us. There are a lot of points there for us to discuss. Let's look at some of the comments by Antonio Costa, of course, briefing European leaders ahead of another NATO meeting with military chiefs later on. He's talking about Ukraine joining the EU. The Slovak Prime Minister saying Ukraine can't join NATO. Is EU membership a potential sideline for Ukraine that will be a positive if NATO membership is not on the table?
I think that's a great point. And if a peace is made in this way, if the Russians will be able to hang on to the territory that they've illegally seized in their war of aggression, then it could be in a similar model to West and East Germany, and whereas Western Germany was able to, following 1945, integrate with Europe and integrate with the rest of the world economy, East Germany languished and fell behind, and the standards of living declined. And this is probably what would happen to the eastern part of Ukraine under Russian rule. The other point that I'd just like to mention very briefly is that this idea of no NATO membership, but Article 5 type guarantees is a very good idea, and I think it's an essential idea, which means that an attack on Ukraine would represent an attack on the other NATO countries. Again, the skepticism that I expressed earlier, I think, still stands.
Yes, absolutely. Of course, that could be an alternative to NATO membership, those security guarantees for Ukraine. Also appeasing Russia's red line of no NATO membership for their European neighbour. Let's briefly look at these comments, Jim, before we wrap up this discussion, from Sergei Lavrov, talking about Russian security guarantees and security guarantees for Russians living in Ukraine. What do you make of these statements?
Well, this is obviously disingenuous. It's highly ironic. that Russia is talking about security guarantees for itself when Russia was the country that invaded Ukraine in an unprovoked attack in February of 2022. So I think that this is just yet another example of the disingenuousness and the lies that are perpetrated by Russia. And of course, Lavrov is a prime example of this. He can't point to a single instance where Russia has been attacked by any NATO country or by Ukraine itself. So I think we can just dismiss this.
Jim Rice, as always, thank you ever so much for providing that insight across a broad spectrum of topics. So many updates expected as diplomacy continues in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Questions about sanctions as well, something we will continue to discuss throughout the day. But let's now move to another conflict in the Middle East. And the United States continues to discuss a ceasefire proposal for a 60-day truce in Gaza. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt confirmed that Hamas has accepted the new proposal. We'll now listen in to what she had to say.
I don't think it's a coincidence that Hamas accepted this proposal after the President of the United States posted a very strong statement about this conflict on Truth Social yesterday. I would refer you back to that statement. As for this proposal that Hamas has now accepted, the United States continues to discuss it, and I'll let the President weigh in.
Well, this comes as a senior Israeli official has stated that Israel will not agree to a ceasefire unless all hostages held by Hamas are released. 50 hostages remain in Gaza, including 20 believed to still be alive. The demand comes after Hamas expressed readiness for fresh talks as mediators work on a new agreement for the return of both Israeli and Palestinian detainees. Meanwhile, in Tel Aviv, families of hostages held a press conference demanding that Israel secure the return of their loved ones. A father of slain Israeli soldier Itay Chen expressed fear that the hostages may disappear forever. We'll now hear what he said.
Today, there are 50 hostages that either are still alive and those that were killed that might disappear forever. And we have an obligation to those 50 hostages as family members, but also the Prime Minister has an obligation as well to those 50 hostages. And the Prime Minister, he has in front of him a deal. It's a deal that we wanted to be a deal for everybody. But he has an obligation, a moral obligation as a Jewish person, as the guy that was in charge.
Well, joining us to discuss these latest developments in efforts to end the war in the Middle East and in Gaza is Madhav Nalapat, editorial director of the Sunday Guardian, who joins us live from New Delhi. Professor Nalapat, as always, a pleasure to be speaking with you. The US saying that they're reviewing this ceasefire proposal, but Israel, for all intents and purposes, have said no to a partial release of hostages. Of course, not confirmed, but clear signs that they want all hostages to be released at once. How do you think the US will react to this, given that this ceasefire proposal is based off a framework that Steve Witkoff, the US envoy, has made and that Israel had previously said yes to?
Look, I would like to say that it's extremely unlikely that Israel is going to agree to a ceasefire until the Hamas is demilitarized and no longer presents a security threat to Israel. Israel faced an existential threat by that October 7 attack, and the Jewish people are not going to forget an existential threat, especially when they went through such horrors during the previous century. So in my view, it's unrealistic to expect Prime Minister Netanyahu to agree to a ceasefire short of getting the hostages back. And I think as a gesture of goodwill, if Hamas can do that and return all the refugees, whether they are unfortunately, those who have perished and those who are still alive. But I think if Hamas does that, possibly Hamas can save itself, although not its military wing. Netanyahu is determined to ensure that the military wing of Hamas is dismantled and can never again attack the state of Israel the way it did so cruelly and so definitively.
Yes, Professor Nalapat, but before we move to a related development, of course, continued protests in Israel. We heard that clip from the father of a slain hostage talking about the need for a ceasefire deal and a hostage release. Of course, pressure from within Israel is mounting. Do you think that will have any part to play in whether Benjamin Netanyahu's government agree to this ceasefire proposal?
No, I don't think so, for a simple reason that the majority of the Israeli population would like the military wing of Hamas at least to be completely dismantled. And quite frankly, as far as the Palestinian Authority is concerned, yes, it should take over Gaza. But the question is, as of now, Hamas will not allow it to take over Gaza, or Hamas will simply merge into the Palestinian Authority and rule Gaza in the name of the Palestinian Authority. So again, from that point of view, it's a non-starter in my view, because the Israelis are absolutely firm. Having gone this far, having frankly endured this much, they are not going to stop. And that is why we can see a human tragedy of terrible proportions playing out in Gaza, and where children are suffering. They're suffering from malnutrition, from starvation, and it's a very terrible situation for them. But the reality is, this is what happens to any part of the world that is ruled by a terror group.
Yes.
That part of the world, sooner or later, slips into this kind of terrible fate. So I'd again like to point out, in my view, it's unrealistic to expect Israel to back off before it succeeds in eliminating the military wing of Hamas. And Hamas, frankly, if it gives up the hostages, it has no cards left. It's got to give up military wing as well. So it's a catch-22 situation, which I don't know how it can be resolved.
Yes, Professor Nalapat, please stay with us. We're now going to turn our attention to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has sharply criticised French President Emmanuel Macron, blaming his recent move to recognise a Palestinian state for fuelling anti-Semitism in France. In a letter to Macron, Netanyahu accused the French leader of appeasing Hamas and emboldening Jew hatred, urging action to address the surge in anti-Semitism before the Jewish New Year on September the 23rd. Meanwhile, French Minister Benjamin Haddad responded, stating that France has no lessons to learn in combating anti-Semitism, and criticised Netanyahu for exploiting the issue. This follows growing international recognition of a Palestinian statehood, with Australia joining the list this month. Well, Professor Nalapat, thank you for staying with us. Of course, this statement from Benjamin Netanyahu follows previous comments made about Anthony Albanese a day earlier. Of course, both France and Australia showing a potential willingness to recognise a two-state solution. Why do you think Benjamin Netanyahu is hitting out at these world leaders who have spoken about a two-state solution? And do you expect more to come?
Well, I'd like to point out that anti-Semitism cannot be equated with anti-Netanyahu comments. And I think one has to make a distinction between the two. There's no question that the Jewish people have contributed enormously to human civilization. They are a wonderful people, extremely wonderful, and there's no question about that. But the reality is that policies of Netanyahu are not very popular in several parts of the world, including most parts of Europe. So, but at the same time, the problem is that this Gaza war and the war in Lebanon has been used by genuine anti-Semitic elements to march on the streets in demonstrations allegedly against Israel, but in reality against the Jewish people. Let's not forget that Hamas, in its charter, made it very clear the Jewish people have no right to exist. Forget Israel. The Jewish people have no right to exist. And don't forget that this is the same credo that motivates the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the same credo that has motivated so many radical groups. So I think, frankly, this is being used as an excuse by genuine anti-Semites to come on the streets. And after Macron's comment, more and more of them are going to flood the streets of Paris. That's a very safe forecast.
Okay, Professor Nalapat, thank you as always for such great insights on such a complex topic. We will continue to monitor the situation in Gaza and the diplomacy around the Israel-Hamas war. Let's now move on though, and in a significant development in India-China relations, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has met with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi to discuss several key areas of cooperation. Both sides have agreed to restart dialogue mechanisms in various fields, aiming to strengthen bilateral ties under the current international situation. Wang Yi highlighted the strategic value of India-China cooperation, emphasising the importance of managing differences, especially regarding border disputes, to ensure peace and stability. On border issues, both sides have reached a new consensus on maintaining peace and tranquility in the region. Additionally, China has agreed to support India in hosting the 2026 BRICS summit, while India will assist China with the 2027 summit. Both countries also agreed to enhance connectivity, including resuming direct flights and reopening border trade at designated points. Well, joining us to discuss all of these updates, Rabinder Sachdev, an international affairs expert, joining us live from New Delhi. Rabinder, thank you as always for joining us. Let's look overall at the picture. Strengthening ties seemingly between India and China. What is the significance?
Thank you very much. I mean, there definitely is a significance. There are multiple significant aspects, I would say. One is broadly between India and China relations, the relations between the two countries. The second is regional implications in central, let's say, Eurasia region. And third is obviously global ramifications, especially in situations when, the US administration is pursuing its tariff policy. India is facing significant tariffs. China is facing some tariffs also, though less than India. But the world order, in a way, is being remade. It is being reconstructed the way I look at it. It's a new matrix in the world which is being constructed right now. Post-COVID, post-Russia-Ukraine war, all nations are rebooting themselves in a way. One. So now, but what we are seeing between India and China is definitely very positive signals, it seems. And new momentum, a new life to China-India relations, it seems, being infused. However, the fact is that this may be seen and perceived as India being cornered due to the pressures of tariffs by America, and thereby India is, warming up to China. And in that process, China could take a situation in a negotiation which is a power situation, because China could assume that, okay, India is moving towards us because it is cornered. What would be better is that if China realizes that it also is being, in a way, cornered, or in the sense that both nations have their own self-interests to work upon.
Yeah.
So that's something I think which will, which will guide all negotiators, because in negotiation, it's often that who makes the first move and then the second, so there's that power play in negotiations and discussions. So the American policies are casting a cloud on that. But notwithstanding that, we got to remember that India-China started talking towards a better relationship 1 year ago in Kazan on the sidelines of the BRICS summit, when Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping met. Since then, things have started moving. Okay, some little bits of, normalization in one space or the other, but now the momentum is gathering pace.
Yes, Rabinder, we have a short amount of time left, but very briefly, we've had experts on this programme talk about this being somewhat of a diplomatic dance. Do you think that is the case, or is this a real step forward between two countries who have had disputes, but as you say, are now potentially aligned in more ways than one?
It's more than a diplomatic dance. Yes, it is a diplomatic dance because that's what kind of sets the contours and the framework. But there is actual movement seeming to happen. India has opened up visas for Chinese tourists, which India had, stopped about 5 years ago. Now there's talk of, direct flights, which were also stopped 5 years ago. There is talk of border trade, though it's very small, but there are 3 points between China and India where there are border trade points for local trading across the borders. Those are being opened up again. And, several other aspects. So I do think, and SCO coming up. So Wang Yi's visit here is, homework for the SCO visit, and hopefully I think Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping meeting. So this is not really a diplomatic dance. I think now it's beyond a diplomatic dance. It's into some concrete steps on the ground.
Rabinder Sachdev, I wish we had longer to speak, but thank you as always for such great insight. That is all that we have time for, but we'll be back soon with more of the latest breaking news from across the world. Thank you.